All right. Welcome to part 2 of my discussion of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract. Today we're going to be talking about Book 1, Chapters 5 and 6. This one may be a little bit shorter than average, but I didn't want to jump over the social contract chapter without really digging into it, and I didn't want to try to also cover some additional concepts like the sovereign, and yada 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 after that. So, we're going to start with Book 1, Chapter 5, and the title of this chapter is That We Must Always Go Back to a First Convention. Now, the first main point that Rousseau makes is that subduing a multitude is different from ruling a society. The former is an aggregation, and the latter is an association. Rousseau is at least trying to differentiate between these two cases. He's also noting that we've seen before that he said that slavery is not something that ever can be validated by force, basically. And the issue here that we're going to see is that Rousseau doesn't put any principled limits on the power of what he calls a legitimate government, and so he kind of devolves himself into the same error or the same justification for working against the government, for opposing it, that he already provided. We're going to see that as we go on and as we talk about this chapter and the next one. Moving on. Rousseau observes or says or claims that an empire based on slavery dissolves upon the death of the tyrant. This is, I think, incredibly overly optimistic, or perhaps overly gentle in its judgment or evaluation of various empires that have existed throughout history. One of the advantages, well, let me not get ahead of myself. Clearly, there have been many associations that, depending on your perspective, could be considered an empire based on slavery. When the people have no real way to voice their concerns for the government, or when the government just in general doesn't act in their interest, that could pretty easily be considered to be an empire based on slavery. And we've seen that those often can go on for a very long time, that the death of the tyrant doesn't mean that the tyrant hasn't prepared for the power that he claims, the property in other people's existences that he claims, to be passed on to some kind of an heir. One of the advantages of the natural law approach of someone like Locke is that it distinguishes between power exercised and power in principle. Power that in principle can be exercised. Most governments in history have not really admitted to any principle limits on their power. Their limits were material, not philosophical. If we went back in time and we handed a bunch of these old empires that admittedly could not exercise very much power over the people, but did not admit to any limits to their power, right? If we gave them the modern surveillance state or drone bombers or something like that, they would very rapidly go into a greater deal of oppression of their subjects. More observation, more cracking down on dissent, that kind of thing. The next thing that Rousseau notes, and it's kind of the last main point of this particular chapter, is that he says that Grotius says a people can give itself to a king, and therefore the people as an organization existed first. What makes a people is the more appropriate question. Majority rule must be based on convention, which presupposes unanimity on one occasion at least. That's a quote. Quote, presupposes unanimity on one occasion at least, right? In order to agree to be ruled by majorities, you must have agreed to be ruled by majorities. And that ruling must have been done without the assumption of rule by majority. That's a good logical point. This is moderately reasonable, but Rousseau is basically trying to steal a base here by implying that a people, right, must be some consistent long-term establishment rather than some temporary alliance of people that have temporary common interests. Cultural similarities can grow or shrink over time, right? There is no force that binds a people, even from simply becoming two peoples with the same identical cultures there can be imagine a group of people existing on top of a fault line, and the fault line goes something like that. It's a little bit silly, but again, the point is that these would now be two peoples, but they would have the same culture, but they'd be in different environments, and so there might be reasons why they would have to make different decisions as to how they decide to govern themselves or each other. It's worth noting that there's no philosophical reason why government must centralize all people who share some particular language, culture, etc., into one body, to be ruled by one body. And there's no reason why a limited government, that is to say limited in principle, cannot also govern groups consisting of multiple peoples, right? Even in a voluntary and sense and kind of serving all their interests. If the government, right, is a voluntary government that deals with, let's just for simplicity say there's two groups, and these two groups disagree strongly about issues X, Y, and Z. As long as the government agrees, and everyone working in the government agrees, and everyone around agrees that the government can't touch issues X, Y, and Z, but they can touch issues A, B, and C where there's general agreement between these two different peoples, you can still have an actual voluntary association that operates that way. It's like, I mean, the silliest example, I love Netflix, I love to use Netflix as an example, but the silliest example is that I can join Netflix and have them provide me with the service that they provide, and a person that disagrees with me on a lot of things can also get on Netflix and take the service that they provide, so long as Netflix doesn't make us try to reconcile our very different beliefs, right? This can work for a large quantity of like law enforcement or justice, broadly speaking, right? People can have agreements that, okay, this body is going to enforce justice against murderers, robbers, and other violent criminals, and you and I might disagree about where the line for fraud is, but if that body never tries to do commercial justice, doesn't deal with civil cases, as we might call them here in the US, then it doesn't make that much of a difference. We can still work with that same group. Yeah, so as long as the government doesn't touch the things where two peoples disagree, it can work for multiple peoples. That's something that a lot of the modern right seems to ignore, is that if you actually have a government that's genuinely limited, that everybody agrees is limited, and again, there are philosophical problems with this universal agreement, right? This is why we try to make things voluntary, make secession a thing, right? But if there were a government that everybody agreed would not touch X, Y, and Z, then two groups that disagree on X, Y, and Z could allow each other and themselves to be governed by this particular government, as long as it remained limited. The reason that these conflicts pop up is because people start saying, well, I want the government to decide X this way, and Group A says no, and Group B says yes, and then you have these conflicts, and the government can only really serve one group at the expense of the other. That's one of the things that government can do, because it is not a voluntary organization. But again, that's part of the problem. But this kind of finishes chapter 5. What we've seen is that Rousseau notes that there's a difference between government as by master over slave, and that there is a such thing as a people, a group of people that Rousseau kind of says demand to be ruled together. Again, we've poked at these things, but these are kind of the points that Rousseau makes in this chapter. Okay, chapter 6 is a bit longer and it has a lot more to it, so we're going to have to spend some time on this one. The first point that Rousseau, first off, the title of the chapter is The Social Compact, but for some reason Rousseau in the body of the text uses social contract consistently. I'm not sure why why he decided to be inconsistent with the title and the body of the text, but that's what it says in the version that I have. The first major point that he makes is that It's similar to Locke's. It's basically that eventually man, independent man, collectivizes because the costs of self-preservation in the state of nature become greater than each individual's ability to pay. Now, this is close, but it's not quite what Locke says, right? Because, number one, if we bring some economic understanding into it, individualist man by himself, in pure autarky, right? No trade, no specialization, is very poor. He doesn't have much to defend, right? And so, in order for Rousseau's point here to be correct, there would have to be a significant surplus for autarkic man to kind of gather, right? He's producing a surplus and producing a surplus and producing a surplus and piling it up, piling it up, piling it up. And that encourages other people to come and try to steal it, right? That's what Rousseau must mean by the costs of self-preservation become greater than the individual's ability to pay, right? Eventually you have to fall asleep. So now you need, 4 people to get together so that, 3 of them are awake at any given time to defend the pile. So in Locke's case, he's not making the assumption that there's these growing costs of self-preservation. He's saying that from the very beginning, the costs of self-preservation are high, and the ability to actually maintain anything, surplus what's in your body, is low, and there's not really any way to prevent someone from saying, hey, that guy stole my whatchamacallit, let's go kill him. And then a bunch of other people come after you based on some set of lies. Locke does a much better job of kind of breaking down the issues with the state of nature than Rousseau does here. I think that's worth noting. But the other point to make about just this particular element of Rousseau's argument here is that this isn't really a problem. This could be done voluntarily and temporarily, right? It could be that I have 3 neighbors and we say, okay, well, we're gonna set up a watch system so that 3 of us that at least 2 of us are always awake or something like that, right? What we're going to discover as we go further into this chapter and into this book is that Rousseau is trying to push this to the limit of unlimited power, and not just that, but permanence. This is another case of Rousseau trying to steal a base. It's kind of appears to be a running theme with him. The next point that Rousseau makes is that because of this rising cost, man aggregates force and liberty into, quote, a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. Now, this language here is crucial because this is not, what Rousseau is writing here is not a picture of unlimited government. It is a picture or a caricature of, because there's the uniting himself with all while still obeying himself alone and remaining as free as before. Even Locke recognizes that you're going to have to give up some freedoms for the purposes of this aggregation. Even if it's voluntary, you're going to have to voluntarily say, well, my watch, right, is from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. I can't sleep at that time. I lose the freedom to sleep at that time. The first part of that quote that I just gave you, protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, is very similar to Locke's perception of a low-level commonwealth, basically. And it appears to be limited. The only purpose of this association is to protect property and person from aggression. The problem is the second part. Rousseau adds this gobbledygook, this while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone, and remain as free as before. He adds this gobbledygook because it confuses the issue. It makes things so, it sets things up so that he gets to add this little bit later on that we're going to see in just a minute. But before we get there, Rousseau notes that the nature of the act of aggregation determines the form of the contract completely. Now this is very important because Rousseau is making a statement here, but he's not actually arguing it. What this basically looks like to me is kind of an attempt to falsely confuse Rousseau's social contract with Locke's natural law. Now, this does get a little bit complicated, so let me go a little slow here. Number 1, Locke is deliberately vague about the terms of natural law, but not their structure. We have to remember from the second treatise, natural law, or the law of reason, as they're kind of stated kind of semi-interchangeably in Locke, are laws that man cannot help but affirm by way of his action. When we looked at this, it seemed like it was kind of things like the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated. That is something that Locke explicitly notes is something comparable, or something that is within the natural law. Now, there's a thing about this that if we have studied Mises, we kind of can note and observe. Locke's description of the law of reason sounds a lot like a description of synthetic a priori knowledge, the kind of thing that Mises called praxeology. I note that Mises' form of liberalism was largely built upon a elaboration of this synthetic a priori knowledge from the action axiom, right? Man acts, he acts to, lessen or eliminate perceived wants or perceived, what's the exact word that Mises uses? I can't remember, but it's something like discomfort, basically. Now, Mises was not a natural law advocate. We have to remember that, right? But the point is that Locke's description of natural law fits in with what Mises derived later. The laws of praxeology would, if Locke saw them, he would say, "Oh, these have all been derived based on an axiom that a person cannot help but support, the action axiom." And so if Locke saw Mises' liberalism, Locke would probably say, "Yeah, this looks a lot like natural law." I mean, it has to. It fits into the same requirements as natural law. Now, Locke's natural law, he didn't go through the whole derivation. So Locke's natural law might contain more than the framework that Mises derived, sure. And it may be that both of them have made mistakes about their logical deductions. But the match in form leads to the implication that Locke's concept of limited government was closer to determined than the hand-waving that Rousseau is doing here. Rousseau is basically saying, the reason, the way that we're doing this means that the form of the contract is determined absolutely. But he hasn't, and he's going to give us the form of the contract in just a moment, but he hasn't actually done any of the derivation. He hasn't said, well, this and this and this, therefore this, therefore this. He hasn't given us any syllogisms. He hasn't given us any logical arguments. He's just kind of declared it. Now, there's a point in chapter 6 here where Rousseau has a quote, "The slightest modification would make them vain and ineffective." And I read this and I was like, well, wait a minute. Is this Rousseau saying if someone breaks the social contract, or if someone decides that someone else has broken the social contract, then they can divest themselves of it? That was kind of like my first look at it. I had to do a double take. It sounds really good, but what Rousseau is actually talking about here is not a government overstepping its boundaries. What he's talking about is how strictly determined the contract he will give below must be. So there's some nice words there that made me think, oh, is he saying, hey, if the government breaks the social contract, then you can leave it? No, that's not what he's saying. Another quote, "As each gives himself absolutely, the conditions are the same for all, and, this being so, no one has any interest in making them burdensome to others." For Rousseau, someone who said that he was trying to look at man as he really is, this is kind of funny. Of course, there will always be some for whom making things burdensome for others is interesting or fun. Business competitors, for instance, might lead to regulatory capture. And we also have to consider the famous chapter 10 of Hayek's Road to Serfdom. Why the worst get on top? If you're going to create a system where there is the ability to get power over other people, that's going to incentivize the people who have the worst desires of what to do with that power to go grab it. Another quote, "There is no associate over whom he does not acquire the same right as he yields others over himself." Now, this sounds nice, but it's really kind of something that you can take apart with the iron law of oligarchy. I'll link to a book chapter by Thorsten Polleit where he talks a little bit about it, but any discussion of the law of oligarchy is fine to, as it applies to politics, is good to look at for explaining why Rousseau is wrong here. One of the problems with the and it's also worth noting that Rousseau uses the word right here. And this is something that we've seen perverted in modern governments to a ridiculous degree, right? The rights that make sense are A, negative rights, right? You may not murder me, you may not rob me, you may not beat me, right? And also things that are decided in an actual contract. You signed a document and I signed a document that says that if I give you X, you will give me Y. I have given you X. We have seen that I have given you X. We both agree that I have given you X. Therefore, I have a right to Y, right? That's a legal right, as opposed to a negative right of individualism, basically. Now, what we've seen recently, not recently, but in the last 100 years, is people throwing whatever they want into the term of rights. And so we're at the point now where everything is a right and nothing is but nothing is an obligation, which is very difficult to deal with. One of the problems with this rights framework, and this is a weakness of the Lockean framework, is that people love to sneak in their pet ideas under the idea of rights. We end up with some bizarre mishmash of internal contradictions, and we start to have to judge competing rights. Rousseau is intentionally creating such a mishmash here. You can't have an absolute right over yourself if the state also has that right, or if every other person has that right. My right to control my body cannot rest 100% in my hands, as well as 100% in the hands of every other person or the state. If you want to start breaking down who has what rights, then we need to start breaking things down into actual, smaller categories. One good example here might be, for instance, if my movement of my hand, right, will bring it into vigorous, uninvited contact with another person, I may not proceed with that act. I don't have the right to vigorously and uninvitedly hit someone. That is a limit of my right to move my body, but it is one that I can give up to a government, right? I can say I pledge not to do that with my hands, right? This is a particular, very small element of things I can do with my body. And if I give up this one little particular thing, it doesn't reflect on the rest of my rights to control my body. I can, in fact, vigorously move my arms around if I reasonably believe that they won't hit anyone uninvitedly. Or, if someone invites me to hit them, then I may hit them if I decide to do so. All this right stuff is dangerous in that sense, because there is always a tendency for people with bad intentions to call something a right in order to get themselves a little extra power. I think it's worth mentioning here that there is one philosopher, at least, who spent a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to kind of reformulate the philosophy of liberty into a non-rights-based framework. That guy's name is Anthony de Jassé. He died a few years ago. He is worth a look if you haven't ever read any of his stuff. Now, I am not a de Jassé expert. I read his book titled Social Justice and the Indian Rope Trick, which was about a different topic. I have his book, The State, kind of in my pile of things to read eventually. I've read a couple of small essays by him here and there. He's a bit opaque and he's kind of wordy, but he does get at some interesting philosophy and he does get at some interesting points. So, if you want to learn more about a concept of freedom that doesn't involve human rights, go check out some of Anthony de Jassé's works. But let's move on. Okay, here is the social contract, according to Rousseau. Quote, "Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole." End quote. Holy crap, this is bad. First off, supreme direction. The state, when created under Rousseau's framework, is completely unlimited in what it may command and how it operates. The general will is a completely weasel is a weasel phrase, basically, that can really be twisted in anyone. At first it might be a majority vote. At first it might be even a supermajority vote, but it eventually gets diluted. People get put up into positions where they are given a lot of prerogative. And we remember from Locke's second treatise that prerogative was one of the big problems that we had from a voluntarist perspective with Locke's conception of the Commonwealth. There's no reason that every form of government must claim absolute authority on the basis of something as nebulous as the general will. There's no reason why this has to be supreme direction, why it has to be the general will. There's no way to actually ensure that it is the general will, since the general will doesn't actually exist. Someone must always be there to say, this is the general will. This is another iron law of oligarchy problem. There's no way to determine the contents of the general will, so it always will come to some oligarchy to make those decisions. And of course, Rousseau's formulation provides no principled limits to the power of the state, which it's not even limited to the powers of the men collected under the state, as Locke did, right? Locke was like, well, obviously the government can't have powers that the people who made it up didn't have, right? And that's why he had the ability to limit prerogative. He's like, well, if everybody agrees that the government should do X, then the government should do X. No one will disagree. That's kind of what his prerogative thing was. Any use of prerogative that has, objections is necessarily dangerous, and Locke recognized that. But Rousseau has created the social contract, and the government can do anything it wants, which means that it's not any different in principle from a master-slave government, which Rousseau already claimed is completely illegitimate. He's basically turned around in a circle on himself and arrived at a master-slave state while previously claiming that no master-slave state can actually be legitimate. This is a really big problem, and it's I think it's worth really noting and thinking about that. If you haven't provided any principled limits for what the state can command its citizens or subjects to do, then you've got a big problem if you also claim that slavery is universally illegitimate. Now, there's going to be more discussion of the general will in Book 2. I read ahead a bit. We'll get to that later. But it's worth noting that this is already extremely dangerous. We have attributed supreme power to the state. We've attributed the decisions as to what the state may or does command to a nebulous thing that does not exist, and we've also noted that each member is an indivisible part of the whole. We've denied the right to secede should the state become tyrannically evil. These are all really, really bad things for Rousseau's system already, and we're only in chapter 6 of book 1. Pretty bad. Next up, quote, "This act of association creates a moral and collective body composed of as many members as the assembly contains votes, and receiving from this act its unity, its common identity, its life, and its will," end quote. Now, this is another base-steel attempt by Rousseau. He is making the state into a person. And this is something that people, poke at a lot, both for good reason and for bad reason, in various liberty circles. But the false identification of the state as a person is basically an attempt to ease the metaphor of the general will, because the general will cannot be anything more than a metaphor. It's not real. There's no thing there. There's no there's no will to look at. There's also this false equivalence, the moral and collective body quote, right, of state policy with morality, which has devastating consequences to incentives, as we've already seen, right? If the state can do anything, it has supreme direction, then the people who actually enact the general will can commit murder, fraud, theft, anything that they want. And because Rousseau has called this a moral and collective body, those acts now become moral in Rousseau's framework. That is extremely destructive, just in principle, to the legitimacy of any Rousseauian government. Now, this fictional body gains a very real will, although that will is actually just the the will of the people who constitute the actual enforcers of the government. Whatever they think they can get away with, they absolutely can. What will end up happening, as we've seen from Hayek, is that the power hungry, the worst in the society, will try to get a hold of that power, then use it in the association against everybody else. There is no philosophical reason why we have to pretend that the state is a person. Rousseau is again stealing a base. The state is a collection of people performing certain acts under the cover of moral duplicity, which is accorded to the state. The state may rob and call it taxation. The state may murder and call it war or law enforcement. The state may kidnap and call it law enforcement, even if there's no actual tort to talk about what this crime was. There need not actually be a victim. The state can just say, "Hey, you committed a crime," and put you in a box. So this cover, this moral duplicity that's accorded to the state, is accorded by way of threats of force or propaganda. And it's important to note these two different ways that this can be done, right? If a man claims that he's your king and he has a bunch of guys with axes that can cut off your head, well, you might listen to what he says, and you might do that. But here's the thing. Your son might not need that threat of violence because the king also hires all the teachers, and he teaches your son that the ruling of the king is righteous and moral and correct, and that your son should willingly give up his own sovereignty or his own will to the will of the king. The first generation might be cowed by threat of force, but the second generation, the third generation, some future generation can be cowed by propaganda alone, can believe that their chains are something that they need and love. This is the kind of thing that Rousseau is trying to get away from, and yet here he goes creating a state that does exactly that. It's another major contradiction that he's not thinking about, apparently, because he doesn't address these problems at all here. Maybe he will later, but so far I haven't seen anything. Now, to pretend that the state is a person is to shift there's another thing that making this state into a person is, like not a non-real person, right? If there's a king, and the king is making all these commands, and you believe that the king is a tyrant, well, you shoot the king, right? There's no moral reason why you can't do that. He's a slave. He's enslaving you per your own perception, per the things that you actually have to do. But if you take the state and you make it into this nebulous thing that doesn't have any real existence, then it also helps. It doesn't necessarily like solve the problem entirely, but it does help to kind of draw responsibility out of the actual people who are enforcing the tyrannical desires of the state. What it does is it shifts responsibility from a real group of people to some kind of phantom. It is an attempt to use a shadow puppet to make tyrants a little bit safer. And it works, again, right? They can use propaganda to tell you that, oh, he was just following orders. But if if you're not already stuck in the mire of propaganda, you can say, well, he was following orders that were given without, a good reason, that they were given for a bad purpose, yada, yada, yada. What making the state into a person does helps to kind of like say, oh no, all of your anger should go that way, not toward me. I'm just doing what the general will is saying. If you don't like the general will, then you need to go talk to the state. I'm not the state. I'm just a tax collector. I'm just, whatever. After this, Rousseau goes on, and he does the first good thing in this chapter. He gives a bunch of definitions. He talks about how a group of people under this kind of state, what he calls it, is a republic or a body politic. He says that when the government is not doing anything, when we speak of it in a passive sense, that is what we call the state. When the government is doing something, when we look at something that the government is doing to us or to someone else, that is what we call a sovereign. I'm going to splice this in here because my notes had a little gap in them. What Rousseau defines for power is he says that powers are what you call governments when they are compared with other governments. So just splicing that in right here, and let's get back to it. And then he also talks about the people and says that we can call them citizens or subjects of the republic or the body politic. So one of the problems that I had with Locke was that he didn't do definitions until way, way late in the book. A lot of the important ones. Here, at least, we got some definitions. It's in a really bad chapter that is devastating to Rousseau's attempt to make a system, but at least we get some definitions, so isn't that nice? Well, that is Book 1, Chapter 5, and Book 1, Chapter 6. We've seen Rousseau's conception of the social contract, and we've observed that it is, number one, totalitarian, number two, trying to self-moralize, and number three, self-contradictory, because Rousseau's already said that slavery, which is to say totalitarianism, encouraged by force, is not valid. Well, Rousseau just made an invalid government based on what he claims is the only social contract that could possibly do what a social contract is supposed to do. This is a bad sign. We're going to keep going, but it is, at least, I think, comforting to note that Rousseau's philosophy is so self-contradictory that he's already killed himself in Chapter 6 of Book 1. Again, we'll keep going, but yeah, this is gratifying, I would say, to find these kinds of logical contradictions this early in the book. And not even like little ones or ones where it's like, well, I can kind of see where he's coming from. He's literally creating an absolute moral state, and then also saying that, well, if the state is, claims itself to be moral and absolute, that's master-slave stuff, and you can resist that. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but there it is. So that is it for this week, at least as far as Rousseau goes. I'm trying to work on some other ideas as well. One cool note is I just sent another article to the Mises Institute, and they're going to run that at some point. They have a big backlog, so it might be a couple of weeks or something like that. But I did a video a while back about entrepreneurs and like media, mass media, and I took that and I turned it into a more carefully reasoned, more carefully sourced essay, and I sent that over to Mises, and they liked it, so that's good. Anyway, that's all I've got for now. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing, if you like this kind of long-form content where I really dig into a book and break it down and find issues and contradictions and refer it to previous books that are interesting as well, and you want to help the channel, you know what to do. As always, there will be links in the description for like show notes and things like that. Those will be hosted over at my blog. And I hope you have an excellent week, and I will see you next time.